gas lines in a country sitting on roughly 303 billion barrels of proven crude are not supposed to exist. Yet Venezuela has lived that contradiction, and the U.S. Energy Information Administration still lists it as holding the world's largest proved reserves. What broke wasn't geology. It was a company that once ran like a technocratic state inside the state. PDVSA in Caracas boardrooms in the 1990s. There was a swagger that bordered on myth. Former insiders and contemporaneous reporting often repeated the claim that PDVSA was worth more than icons like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and IBM. Impossible figure to verify cleanly because PDVSA was never a listed stock, but revealing in what Venezuelan elites believed they had built. The logic was seductive. Control the wellhead, own the refineries, reach the consumer. The footprint was real. PDVSA's U.S. arm, Citgo, still operates 3 refineries with about 829,000 barrels per day of capacity. A strategic asset that has spent years in courtrooms and sanction debates, according to Reuters. Then the human machinery snapped. After the 2002-2003 strike, more than 18,000 employees were fired, according to CSIS and the Congressional Research Service, draining expertise overnight. When oil money stops being managed and starts being harvested, pipelines corrode, catalysts fail, and a petrostate discovers it can run out of gasoline. For investors watching supply shocks, the question isn't nostalgia, it's whether those barrels ever come back and on whose terms to global markets quickly. It starts with a number that should make any markets person uneasy: about 303 billion barrels of proved crude reserves, the largest on Earth, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's the kind of endowment that usually buys a country leverage, cash flow, and options. Venezuela got something else, a national oil company that, for a time, looked like a masterclass in state capitalism, and then became a warning label. The legal switch was set before the flag raising on August 29, 1975. Venezuela published a law reserving the hydrocarbons industry to the state, and it set January 1, 1976 as the date concessions would be void. According to reporting summarized by EFEP, PDVSA was born in that moment, created through nationalization. On January 1, 1976, as Encyclopedia Britannica describes it, what followed was decades of engineers, traders, and refinery people turning crude into political independence and, for stretches of time, into serious production volumes. Even the U.S. Congress tracked how central PDVSA was to the country's economic life and how quickly output started sliding after the early 2000s shock. Some Venezuelan insiders and commentators liked to brag that PDVSA was worth more than America's corporate royalty Coca-Cola, McDonald's, IBM. You can't validate that cleanly the way you would a listed company's market cap. But the fact that the claim circulated tells you how powerful the myth became inside Venezuela. If you want more reporting like this, where geopolitics meets balance sheets, hit like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm there's demand for serious finance and energy stories, and for transparency. Every source behind the numbers you hear in this video is listed in the description. In the late Cold War years, PDVSA wasn't trying to be a patriotic symbol. It was trying to be hard to kill. The executives running it understood a basic problem that still defines Venezuela today. Most of the prize sits in extra heavy crude, especially in the Orinoco Belt, and extra heavy oil doesn't behave like a neat North Sea barrel. It needs upgrading, blending, specialized hardware, and steady discipline. The U.S. Energy Information Administration puts it plainly: most proved reserves are extra heavy, and the technical demands are higher than conventional fields. So the company went shopping for something more valuable than wells, guaranteed customers. PDVSA's internationalization push was built around a simple hedge: if you owned the refineries and the downstream channels, you were not begging a foreign buyer every time OPEC politics shift or a price cycle turns nasty. That's the logic that took PDVSA into the United States and into Europe, not as a tourist, but as an operator. Start in the US, because that's where the footprint is easiest to see in real steel. PDVSA bought 50% of Citgo in 1986, and then acquired the remaining half in 1990, according to Citgo's own corporate history. That timeline matters because it pins down when Venezuela's state oil company decided it wasn't enough to export crude. It wanted to own the last mile of the business. Americans actually touched refining terminals brands on street corners. Citgo today still advertises what that bet created: 3 deep conversion refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois, with combined capacity around 829,000 barrels per day. Reuters has reported the same capacity figure in the context of the legal battle over Citgo's future, which is its own kind of market signal. This isn't nostalgia, it's a live asset that creditors, courts, and Washington all care about. Europe was never an afterthought either. PDVSA's joint ventures there weren't just flags on a map. there were a second set of captive outlets. A detailed academic review of PDVSA's structure and foreign operations notes that PDVSA ran its European downstream through PDV Europa and held to major joint ventures RUA and Nenezand, that those ventures together operated 8 refineries. One reason RUA matters is that it was built as a 50/50th joint venture back in 1983, and BP, after acquiring Viva Oil, explicitly described RUA GmbH as continuing that lineage with PDVSA as the Venezuelan partner. This is what vertical integration looked like in practice. A state company from Latin America sitting inside German refining infrastructure, not as a marginal supplier, but as an owner. The scale, at least on paper in that era, was not small. That same PDVSA-focused study describes PDVSA as an integrated firm with total refining capacity around 3.1 million barrels per day in the mid-2000s, counting operations across Venezuela, the US, the Caribbean and Europe, and it frames PDVSA as one of the largest refining players globally at the time. Here's the part investors tend to miss when they hear PDVSA bought refineries. It wasn't just empire-building vanity. It was a risk management strategy designed for a producer whose barrels were getting heavier, more complex, and more politically exposed. Own the upgrader, own the coker, own the retail chain. And you've built a pipeline of demand that doesn't disappear the day sentiment turns against your country. That's how a state oil company could start believing its own legend, so much so that people inside Venezuela would casually claim it outvalued American blue chips. It's a slippery claim to prove in market cap terms because PDVSA wasn't publicly listed, but as a piece of psychology, it tells you what PDVSA thought it had achieved. Insulation from the outside world, purchased one refinery at a time. The breaking point wasn't a single explosion or one bad year of oil prices. It was the moment PDVSA stopped behaving like a technically run operator and started behaving like a political organ with a cash register attached. The purge after the 2002-2003 strike is the cleanest hinge in the story because it's measurable. CSIS describes the government shedding more than 18,000 of PDVSA's roughly 33,000 employees in early 2003, many of them highly skilled. The economists used similar language at the time, framing it as firing more than 18,000, almost half the workforce. The Congressional Research Service is blunt about the mechanism. The strike and the firing of some 18,000 workers helped drive a decline the company never fully reversed. If you want to understand why that matters financially, don't picture an HR event. Picture a refinery where the same handful of people know how to restart a unit without cracking a catalyst bed. Picture a heavy oil system where the upgrader has to run within narrow tolerances or you end up with unusable product. When those people leave, the system doesn't just slow down, it gets brittle. That brittleness showed up in the production line first, then in the balance sheet of the country. The CRS notes that Venezuela's total oil production fell from about 3.46 million barrels per day in 2002 to 2.58 million by 2012. A newest CRS update makes the arc impossible to ignore. When Chavez took office in 1999, crude production was about 3 million barrels per day. By the time he died in 2013, it was 2.7. Under Maduro, it dropped below 0.5 million barrels per day in 2020 before climbing again, reaching just above 1.0 million barrels per day by August 2025. Those aren't abstract volumes, that is Venezuela's fiscal oxygen thinning. By the mid-2010s, the decline got steeper. The EIA notes the production collapses were especially acute after mid-2016, with crude output falling sharply over a short span. The Baker Institute ties the collapse to a mix that investors will recognize immediately: years of underinvestment, operational problems, mismanagement, lower oil prices, and sanctions interacting, not taking turns. The Financial Times, reporting from the perspective of foreign executives and analysts, described a cash drain compounded by mismanagement at PD. Here's where the PDVSA was worth more than Coca-Cola, McDonald's. IBM claim becomes psychologically useful even if it's hard to audit like a market cap. A company that believes its own legend starts acting as if the asset base will always be there tomorrow. Maintenance can wait. Training can wait. A turnaround can be postponed. Engineers are replaceable. Then reality shows up as corrosion, deferred capex, cannibalized spare parts, and refineries running like old cars you keep pushing past the red line because you can't afford to stop. Geopolitics made the trap tighter. The Council on Foreign Relations summarizes how government mismanagement and US sanctions contributed to steep underinvestment and falling production. Even if you take politics out of it and look purely at finance, the effect is familiar: restricted access to capital, higher counterparty risk, fewer credible partners willing to sink money into long-cycle projects, and a company forced into short-term decisions. And once the downstream begins to fail, it gets personal. In an oil country, gasoline scarcity is not just a policy headache. It's a legitimacy crisis you can see at street level. The same structure that once made PDVSA hard to kill, integrated assets, complex refineries, specialized heavy oil processing, also made it unforgiving. When governance weakens, an integrated machine doesn't degrade gracefully. it drops parts on the highway. By the time production hit its low point around 2020, as the CRS documents, PDVSA wasn't merely smaller, it was operating with less resilience, less competence, density, and less room to absorb shocks. The open question for markets was no longer how big are Venezuela's reserves. The EIA already answered that. The question became, who would trust the system enough to rebuild it, and what would they demand in exchange? For markets, PDVSA isn't a tragedy in a history book. It's a live variable in the price of crude, in refinery margins, in shipping patterns, in sanctions risk, in the way creditors price emerging market exposure. Venezuela still sits on the largest proved reserves on Earth, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. But reserves don't hedge supply shocks. Deliverable barrels do. What makes the PDVSA story so unsettling is how fast capacity turns from an engineering concept into a geopolitical weapon. The Congressional Research Service tracks how output fell from around 3 million barrels per day at the start of Chávez's tenure to well under 1 million in the Maduro era, hitting a trough below 0.5 million in 2020 before a partial rebound. That arc is not just misfortune. It's a system losing the habit of competence. When the post-strike firings removed more than 18,000 workers, as CSIs and CRS describe, the damage wasn't symbolic. It was operational memory walking out the gate, and the downstream matters as much as the upstream. The U.S. arm that PDVSA built, Citgo, still represents roughly 829,000 barrels per day of refining capacity, which is why it keeps showing up in Reuters' coverage of litigation and creditor claims. A company can lose wells and still survive if it retains know-how, capital access, and credible governance. Lose those at the same time, and even a vertically integrated empire starts to look like stranded steel. There's one more layer investors shouldn't ignore: the myth. The old boast that PDVSA was worth more than Coca-Cola, McDonald's, IBM is hard to validate like a market cap, because PDVSA wasn't listed, but the boast itself is a data point. It tells you how a resource state can confuse scale for durability right up until maintenance stops, partners leave, and the balance sheet becomes politics. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If Venezuela ever stabilizes enough to bring meaningful barrels back, does the world get a re-engineered PDVSA or a permanently smaller industry carved up by creditors, sanctions, carve-outs, and foreign operators? If you want more work like this, hit like and subscribe. It's the clearest signal that these deep-dive geopolitics and market stories are worth producing.